So this is an unusual sounding talk, perhaps. The title of the talk is The Criminality from Face Illusion. And this is a talk that I gave, or this is an updated version of a talk that I gave to the Kansas Data Science Consortium 4 or 5 weeks ago. The concept of criminality from face, in terms of AI, machine learning, computer vision, data science, is that I could create an algorithm. We might think of it as a black box in the sense that it's probably a deep neural network, and deep neural networks are black boxes because we don't have a great handle on what exactly processing is being done on the input until you get to the output. And it's really hard to give names to the features that are being computed of the image in order to get your output. But the idea is that there would be a face image as input, and it would get processed by an algorithm. And at the other end, the algorithm would say whether this person is a criminal or not, or whether this person has criminal tendencies or not, depending on how people working on it phrased it. So that's it. That's the concept right there. And the particular paper that we're going to spend a little bit of time on specifically, and where there'll be some lessons, is this one called Criminal Tendency Detection from Facial Images and the Gender Bias Effect. So they're actually going to look both at, can we predict criminality from face images, and is the quality of our prediction any different for men or women? And it's in the journal called the Journal of Big Data, which is certainly computer science oriented. And it's published by a company called Springer, which is an old and well-known name in the publishing industry. The faculty researchers there are from George Mason, and I forget where Margaret Hall is from. Mahdi Hashimi is at George Mason, I believe, still there. And the little highlighted quote there, 2 deep learning models, deep neural networks, including a standard feed-forward neural network and a convolutional neural network, which would sort of be the main thing in tool vision transformers, are applied to discriminate criminal and non-criminal facial images. And the sentence that caught my mind, beyond just the concept, was this: the test accuracy of 97%. So they've developed an algorithm, they've tested it in their terminology of testing, and they've achieved 97% accuracy, exceeds our expectations, a clear indicator of the possibility to differentiate between criminals and non-criminals using their facial images. From what you know right now, do you think these researchers actually developed an algorithm that you could give it the next 1,000 face images of decent quality that you pull off the web or you take walking around campus or around town, and actually classify criminal, non-criminal from the face image with anything close to 97% accuracy? I see some shaking heads. Well, let's talk in this class period a little bit about why you might think that's not impossible. And then let's go into sort of the analysis of myself and a couple of colleagues on why it might actually be impossible. So we're going to do history of face recognition really quickly, just to give you a perspective. So if you had been around for the last decade, kind of what you would have thought was possible or how quickly you thought the field was changing. And then a little bit about the breadth of image analysis. And at least in 1 or 2 of these examples, you might think you can't do that, but you can. All right, and that sort of might set the stage for why people would think they could do what this paper says it can do. So face recognition, the idea of taking a picture, processing it, and saying who the person is, that is matching it to another image of the person that's on file in order to say these 2 match, and so I know who this unknown image is, probably dates back to around the early 1970s. The person I've put here is a guy named Takeo Kanade, who was the leader of the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon forever. and I think he's retired, and I think he's back in Japan. This was his PhD dissertation, actually. And the fact that the images are not great quality and that you don't recognize the names of the equipment and stuff like that is because this is in the 1970s, early 1970s. When I give this talk, he is the person I point to as the first serious researcher in automated face recognition. There's another school of thought that says it was somebody on the West Coast of the United States, but it's not that important. And the kind of features that Takeo was thinking about processing in the face in order to say who that person is, to match this face image to another face image, to say they match so well that it's the person in the registered face image. If you look at it, he's sort of got the eye centers, and he's got the nose tip, and he's got angles of the chin, and he's sort of processing the 2D image, assuming you're looking straight ahead, and getting some points, distances, and angles, and ratios of those. And he's got a list of, 16 different features there, and that was sort of how he thought about face recognition, how the field thought about face recognition in the very, very earliest days. And face recognition was a quiet backwater of artificial intelligence for going on 2 decades, something like that. Somewhere around 1990, I think at a conference on the island of Maui, I saw this work presented, Eigenfaces presented. Eigenfaces was somebody else's PhD dissertation, Matt Turk at MIT at the time, at Toyota Tech in Chicago now. And his idea was, all those features that you're explicitly finding, like eye centers and nose tip and mouth corners and all that kind of stuff. We've been doing this since the early 70s. It's not getting us anywhere. What if we take a more rigorous mathematical approach? Researchers like to talk about their work as rigorous mathematical approach. And so if we take the images, and they're all the same size, cropped to the same size of the face, and we turn them into rows, the pixel values into rows, and we make a huge matrix, and go back to your linear algebra course, we do an eigenvalue decomposition on that, then we throw away some of the dimensions and we keep a smaller number, then every person might be a point in that space, and their images might map to near that point. And you might do face recognition that way. And so from 1990 on, the idea that you had to collect a whole lot of data sets to train your algorithms, and that you'd sort of given up designing in the features, the algorithm was going to sort of learn the features from the data you gave it. That wasn't new with neural networks, at least in face recognition. It was there with eigenfaces. Went on for a while, and Jonathan Phillips, who I'm going to mention again in a moment, was a government program manager who came up with some standardized ideas for how we're going to fund, select researchers, and nurture the field of face recognition forward. And he was doing that late 1990s for a decade or two. And this is one of his early best-known papers. The little thing down there in the lower right, 6,700 citations to one of his papers about the methodology. Those are really good numbers. Current face recognition, reasonably current. The reference point for new algorithms would be something called ArcFace. It came out of Imperial College around 2018. And I think of it as having kind of 3 main insightful elements to how to do this, how to do face recognition. One of them was to use something called a ResNet, which is a particular style of deep neural network, which does some things with the architecture to make it more stable to train very large neural networks. That's enough for that right now. The other was to recognize that these data sets that people are doing, Jonathan Phillips had started off collecting images in the lab, and actually we collected some of the images here at Notre Dame for some of his programs he ran. And we thought we were great. We would collect tens of thousands of images of thousands of people. But deep neural networks are really, really hungry. Turns out they do better if they have millions of images from hundreds of thousands of people, and we're just not going to collect that explicitly, but you can go out on the web and you can collect data by web scraping. The ArcFace group wasn't the first to do that, but they were one of the early ones to say, web scraping doesn't work very well. Web scraping is essentially the idea you get a list of names, probably of celebrities. You go out to the web and you find web pages where that name appears in the text, and you find a picture and you pull down the picture and you detect the face in the picture, and you hope that the dominant face in the picture and the dominant face in the text correspond. But it doesn't always work that way, right? Favorite example that we saw in one of our projects, figure skating, championship figure skating pair. And quite often they were together in the photo, and the woman was being held or twirled or whatever and was smaller than the man who was able to pick her up and toss her around. And so most of the photos in her folder from automated web scraping actually turned out to be of him, right? So you get problems like that. So the ArcFace group said, no, we got to clean this data up. We're going to do some automated cleaning on the web scraped data. And that turned out to be really, really important. And then they thought about it and said, okay, our goal when we train the deep neural network is to get all the pictures of Kevin kind of clustered together on this in a small area, and I'm going to use the phrase of a 512 dimensional hypersphere. My brain doesn't go very well beyond 3 dimensions, but if you could imagine a sphere in 512 dimensions, you could cluster a lot of different people in limited regions of that surface of that sphere. So that's sort of their idea. Data sets for face recognition. I mentioned that ArcFace in 2018 was cleaning a previously web scraped data set by some researchers at Microsoft. That was the MS1M, Microsoft 1 million, which had been around for only about 2 years until somebody came along and said, hey, that data set's no good. We've got to clean it in order for it to make any sense to use. And so the people who did Microsoft 1 million saw a shelf life of about 2 years until the whole effort became obsolete. One of the things illustrated here is that this is a 2021 paper, the data set they collected is the ones in the upper right. 2 million identities, 42 million images, 4 million identities, 260 million images. Those are sort of state-of-the-art, large size web scraped face image data sets for training neural networks to do face recognition nowadays. Last slide for background in face recognition. Jonathan Phillips, the same one who did ferret methodology a couple slides ago, came up with this slide because he was a government program manager and he participated in most of the programs listed there. If you go back to 1993, the US government is kind of interested in face recognition. It says, let's benchmark the research community and see what they've got. And when they did that, the false reject rate, FRR, at a false accept rate of 1 in 1,000. That means if I was enrolled in a face recognition system and you wanted to get in as me, if you had 1,000 random people come and try to get in as me, one of them might match, right? So that's the false accept rate. Then what's the false reject rate? That's how many times I go up and it says, you're not Kevin, and says, you got to try again, or you got to come back some other time. Well, in 93, that was 79% of the time. So it was a totally unusable system at that security level, right? 1 in 1,000 sounds okay as security, but not highly secure because you could recruit somebody who was my height and shape and all that kind of stuff. But it was totally unusable. 97, well, it got 54%. That's still totally unusual, but that's a big improvement. 2002, it's down to 20%. So 80% of the time I can get in with the first try at 1 in 1,000 security. That's beginning to feel like it might be usable. Jonathan also had to switch data sets because the size of the data set that you can measure differences between the top 2 algorithms in. You need a lot of data to get a statistically significant difference between the high-performing algorithms. So the color in the bars changes because he had to go to a larger data set. And the data sets started coming from inside the government, so nobody can get a copy of them except the people inside the government any longer. And by 2006, 13 years after 1993, in the first test on a larger data set, the false reject rate is down to 2.6%, 97% plus time you get in first thing with a 1 in 1,000 false accept rate, really great. And then it drops to 0.003. It's essentially unmeasurable. And so the people running the programs changed again and said, okay, this matching of one image to one image, we just need a phenomenal amount of data to be able to measure progress on that. And we don't, at the time, have access to that kind of data. So we'll switch over and we'll talk about doing a one-to-many search. So I got a picture from the camera that's watching the classroom, who's walking down front. I've got that picture, and I'm going to match it against every student enrolled to find out who it is. And it's going to give me back the closest match, and I'm going to look at what percentage of the time is the closest match from this retrieval from a large number of images, the right person for the probe image I searched with. National Institute of Standards can do that on 12 million people in the gallery. So they can search one photo against photos of 12 million. ArcFace, the algorithm we mentioned earlier, will return the correct person as the rank 1 match if they're in the database, something like 9,900 and some times out of 10,000. Phenomenally accurate, at least in a historical perspective, on a really hard problem, searching for the closest person and is it the right person to the image you search with. So it's the rank 1 retrieval rate. And you can see that accuracy is getting better all the time. And there's probably one more study after this that I don't have there. So if you just sort of taken a look at the literature and said, things are getting so much better, so much faster. And using these data sets that people have sort of found online, web scraped, seems to be okay. And these deep CNN, convolutional neural network models, seem to be really, really good. And no one seems to be terribly disturbed by the idea that the 512 features that correspond to the dimensions of the space that we're representing people in, they don't have names and interpretations like distance between the eyes, or distance from the eyebrow to the chin, or ratio. They just aren't describable in natural language. They're just learned from this enormous amount of data. No one seems terribly disturbed by that. So why couldn't I do criminality from face? Acquire some data, train a deep neural network. That would be my reference algorithm. But data set. I mean, we can get data of images of celebrities kind of with their names sort of attached. So we need to check and make sure it's right. There is no real good data set for doing criminality from face. And data set's going to be a theme in a moment. There is no standard reference algorithm. If you wanted to, you could go get ArcFace from the GitHub of the researchers in Imperial College, and you could start using it in your own thing. It's a free open source thing. Well, there's nothing like that for this problem, for good reason. And so you have nothing to benchmark against. And the whole concept of criminal or not, if you think about it deeply, I'm going to argue that it's not a well-founded categorization of images. Okay, so that's maybe, if the researchers are looking at face recognition, maybe they got the feeling that things are improving by this orders of magnitude every couple of years. We went from totally unusable to on one-to-one to amazing on one-to-many search. And if they looked broader around at computer vision, they would find some other things. They would find out that in the field of affective computing, AFFECTIVE, that is understanding how the computer understanding how the person feels so it can interact with the person better. Been around for a couple of decades. There are surveys about it, and the idea is that you can see from someone's facial expression how they might be feeling. You might get some insight into their emotional state. And so categorizing things into smiles, frowns, angry, was it fear, surprise, disgust, contempt, embarrassment. And I think that's kind of a standard set of things. There are lots of algorithms out there that can take face images and from the configuration of some landmark points on the face, categorize the face image pretty accurately into these and neutral. no particular expression. You can imagine how they might do that from just thinking about the corners of the lips and the eyebrows and the eyes. What are the relative configurations that would make you put an image in one of these categories? So if you weren't careful and didn't think, okay, it's the configuration of the landmark points on the face, and I might fake a smile even when I'm not happy, you might think you were getting insight into the emotional state with more clarity than you are. There are also a whole bunch of people that do other things, predict age, gender, ethnicity of the person from the face image, predict body mass index, which is sort of more of a health-oriented metric, but you can actually do that reasonably well. There's a startup that a friend of mine has as his thing on the side from his university job, where he's helping life insurance companies underwrite life insurance policies, and he can take your facial image, guess at your BMI, claims that he can tell if you're a heavy smoker for any length of time, heavy drinker for any length of time from signs that are visible on your face. Think about how the lips will change if you're smoking regularly, and how alcohol would change if you use too much for a long period of time. So you can see that there's real things being done to get some insights of a kind into health. And then this is the first one. This is the one that when I was first told about this, I said, that's not possible, right? I'm just going to point a video at you, color video, and I'm going to take video of your face. It doesn't have to be your face. It could be your open arm or legs or some other part of your body. And I'm going to read out your pulse rate. That sound cool? I saw Roz Picard, the senior author on the back paper there, demonstrate this live at a conference. Just turn the webcam on her and start talking, and her heart rate coming out. So at which point I began to go, maybe that works. This is a demo from our lab here at Notre Dame, and I don't know if you can read it. The predicted heart rate from the face video being processed is it right around 76? That's the top one. The oximeter, the little thing you can put on your finger, is reading out about 77. So it's like 1 off. 2 beats off is nothing. It's not going to change any of your diagnosis from health-wise. And you can see the predicted waveform from the deep neural network processing the video as the person's moving and the oximeter. So it turns out that it actually really is easy to do this. And if I mention that your cheeks turn red sometimes, right? Then all of a sudden you realize there's blood flow under the skin. And I've got color, I've got RGB. And I might look at the frequency of changes in the red and the green, or a hybrid of the red and the green, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, well, maybe you are able to see the blood flowing towards the surface of the skin in the face video, and so maybe it's entirely reasonable that you read out the heart rate. Hospital. Well, but criminality from face, I mean, we could tell it's a smile that I'm making if my bottom of my lip and my corners of my lip sort of point up, right? We could tell surprise if my eyebrows are kind of raised. So we got landmark points we can find on the face. And they sort of correlate with facial expression. We can give a definition. If you go back to that figure, you could say, okay, when the corners of the mouth are above, and you could come up with some rules that tell you how to categorize it, right? It's not clear what you would do to say that person's a criminal. And unlike pulse rate, maybe your pulse would get faster when you commit the crime. But if you're really good at pretending later that you didn't, that's not much use for anything. So unlike pulse rate, there's no definition in the time pattern of blood flow that you can measure. And that brings us to kind of the end of being able to explain why people might think there's magical stuff that could happen in computer vision and face image analysis. There's enormous accuracy changes over a couple of decades. There are some really interesting health indicators you can get, but we're looking at something deeper here. So this is the earliest paper I can remember. It never got peer-reviewed, published, I don't believe, which did inference of criminality from face images. And you can find their paper on arXiv, and you can find update to it where they complain about people not accepting their paper. And there's an example from their paper of some images of criminal photos, criminal category face images in the top row, and non-criminal category face images in the bottom row. And I want you to look at them for a second. And I want you to think about, is there a great clue there that works for those images? What do you think? How would you separate those two categories of images? No?
The first look more tired.
The first look more tired. Look right here. What do you see? What do you see in the bottom row? A little bit of white shirt and a suit over top. What do you see in the top row? Absence of that. If you wrote an algorithm that was really great at finding light-dark contrast in the lower part of the image, you might do really well at separating these two categories of images. Does that make sense? It's no insight into the state of the person, but it's an insight into the commonality shared between one category of images versus another category of images. Hold that thought in mind for a minute. It's another paper that showed up at some conference I've never heard of, which is also claiming they can classify criminal, non-criminal from the face image. Still another paper in a conference I've heard of, but it's not a very competitively peer-reviewed conference. But also the output is criminal, non-criminal at the end. And this is a paper we'll come back to at the very end. In another Springer journal, they think they've developed a model that had comparatively greater accuracy. They don't bother referencing the one that said it had 97%, so they still think they have greater accuracy at 95%. This illustrates that their proposed framework accurately identifies criminal and non-criminal faces. Can you imagine what government agencies and large corporations, if you could really do this, would pay for the source code? I mean, this is phenomenal, right? 95% out of the box with no investigation other than the face image, right? This is the paper that we actually spent most of our time on, the 97% accuracy. And when I say we all these times, that's actually myself and Mike King and Walter Scheirer. Some of you know Walter and had him for a class probably. And Kushal, who's going to get his PhD from FIT with Mike sometime this year. Okay, so we saw the paper and we talked about it and we decided, you know, actually, this is being silly. You can't do this, which is really hard for a researcher and a modern thinking person to say, you can't do that. But you've all had the algorithms course and the theory course, so you actually know that there's some things that are not doable, that are well described. And this paper actually did not solve that problem, even though they say they did. And more dangerously, if people believe this and start using it, it's going to cause enormous problems, right? So that was our 3 theses in response to the paper. And I always feel a little bit self-conscious trying to convince people you can't do something. It's not worth trying because that's just not in the nature of academics. But and the standard way of doing that is really not you can't, it's you shouldn't, right? And that comes from the humanities side. But I wanted a data science, machine learning, computer science side argument for you can't do that. That's just stupid to think of when you actually confront the problem. So training a classifier in machine learning, you can't train it unless you have data to train it on. You need some labeled data. You need some images that you said represent criminal and some images that you say represent non-criminal. That's your training data to train an algorithm that you're going to then eventually use on future images. So in this instance, we've got to have some images that we have been willing to label criminal and non-criminal. And this is the part that I'm going to argue is not doable. And some of you will have heard of this lady, Elizabeth Holmes, ex-CEO of Theranos. And you might recognize some of these images. And so the one on the far left is chosen to be from a time in her life when I think most observers would say she's still young, idealistic, trying really hard, raising money, finding out about the problem, doing things. She's a young entrepreneur, a couple of years out of dropping out of chemical engineering at Stanford. So not a criminal. At least no crimes alleged to have been committed and no convictions. And then we have a picture from her glory days with the hair and the makeup and the magazine covers. Late enough in that, yeah, she's been giving the fake demos to board members and funders for a while now. So there's kind of no question that the fraud is ongoing, but it wasn't widely recognized as a fraud. You're going to see why, in part, when you do the next homework assignment. And then we've got another picture after conviction. We sort of separated out after the crime was going on, after it was recognized by a conviction. And she's currently in prison camp in Texas till 2032. So labeled training data. You got 3 images of this person. What are you going to put with each of the images? Are you going to put criminal or are you going to put non-criminal? And in deciding what you're going to do, you're confronting your philosophical commitment to what this problem is, right? Which category does each label get? This forces you to make your actual bets, declare your bets for what it is your algorithm is doing, what it is your algorithm is learning, what is the phenomena in reality that you're going after. Well, labeling them all non-criminal, I don't think anyone proposes that. I mean, she really did commit a crime, get convicted of it. So let's kind of dismiss that. Another thing that you will find in the broad world, there will be some number of people committed to. All the images the same. They're all criminal. So Elizabeth Holmes, she's a criminal. All the images get labeled criminal, right? Well, including the image from before we have any feeling that she really committed the crime, and certainly before she's convicted of the crime, and labeling that one criminal means that you're sort of headed to the philosophical conclusion that some people are born as criminals and I can predict their future state as criminal, right? When you recognize that that's what you're doing, I would philosophically accept that's not possible. You can't tell from an image that someone's going to become a criminal 10, 20 years in the future. But that's the philosophical commitment if you head down that road. The other one is also really, really troubling, but in a different way. If you label the early one non-criminal and both of the later 2 or the later one criminal, latest one criminal, then your theory has to be that either when I commit the crime or later when I'm convicted of the crime, there's something about my face, some set of muscles somewhere, or some part of my skin that changes. So that my face is reliably different in photographs as a result of the act of committing a crime or as a result of the act of being convicted or arrested, if you'd like, as a way station in there. Well, so, okay, when I smile, my lips turn up. When I commit a crime, my what? My ears stand farther out. My eyebrows are permanently straighter. I don't know. I mean, I've never heard anybody make any kind of convincing this visual aspect of a face changes as a result of committing a crime or as a result of being convicted of a crime. Yet that's what you have to do if that's how you're going to decide to label the images. And it's worse than that. I've been very US-centric. I picked out Elizabeth Holmes and all that stuff. That's an automatic weapon that you could hold in your hand. That would not be illegal in most of the United States, but it would be illegal in the UK. So when I'm training the algorithm, do I have to label the images according to the jurisdiction in which the algorithm is going to operate? because the laws are different in different jurisdictions. Oh my, well, this is the same images labeled differently depending on where I'm going to use the algorithm I trained. This is a bit of a problem already, but it gets worse than that because occasionally the court system in different countries will decide that something that was illegal is not illegal. So now I need to actually label all the images for a jurisdiction and a period of time and train the algorithm, and then it's only good for that jurisdiction in that period of time, and it has to be redone for all the other various jurisdictions and periods of time. And if this doesn't convince you that this is just a hopeless task, right? I'm not sure that I know how to convince you from a data science perspective. It is not possible to collect and consistently label data to train a algorithm to predict criminal, non-criminal from face images. You can't do that. Well, wait a minute. The paper said that it did. They did some training and they got 97% accuracy. So what exactly did they do? This is a quote from the paper. We got some grayscale mugshot images of arrested individuals from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So that's the place in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Still there, even in the current economic climate. And they have data sets they've collected to let people do various things. And one of the data sets they have available online you can get for free is images, mugshot images of people who've been arrested. So in the paper, they say they use that and they reference this NIST data set, NIST Special Database 18, and they give you the URL to go and get a copy of the data set. So being curious what they'd done, we go to the NIST website and we pull out the documentation. And the documentation says, well, this special database is a collection of 3,248 grayscale mugshot images of varying sizes of 1,573 people. And 1,333 of the people have both profile and frontal images. So wait a minute. 3,248 and 1,333 of those are not usable because they're profile. And wait a minute, 8,401, 3,248. Do you see a problem? Do you see a problem? What's the problem? Not hard. You can do this math in your head. They say they obtained 8,401 images from a site that says it supplies 3,248. And for purposes of this algorithm, 1,333 of those 3,248 are not usable. Well, where do the images come from, right? So one of the authors is at George Mason. I got my undergraduate degree there. I can write an email and say, hey, Professor Hashimi, I'm looking at your paper and I'm not following something. Can you point me to where you got the mugshot images, right? Hi, Kevin. Greetings and hope all is well. You can find thousands of mugshots on https://mugshots.com. That wasn't mentioned in the paper. What's going on? And what is mugshots.com? Well, it turns out arrest photos in maybe all jurisdictions, most for sure, in the United States are public record. They're acquired with taxpayer dollars, and it's maybe philosophically even really good if you can't be arrested in the United States without a record of that arrest being public so that people can find out. Countries where people can be arrested with no public record are something we like to think is not possible. So there are places called mugshots.com. So more email ensued, and I don't know how many emails. I should get a count. And it's like, okay, which images did you use? And were they all from this site? Well, there's lots of sites. Yes, but what I'm asking is, where did the images used as mugshot images in your paper come from? And can I get a copy of those particular images? In the end, I gave up. I was unable to get a copy of the images used by the researchers in the paper, or even to get something that I regarded as a clear indication of where the images came from. A lot of the images on the mugshots.com that you would just download for free are watermarked with something so that you will pay the person who collected them for free from the states. Who knows where they are? Okay. Well, that's not the worst of it. We've got this 8,401 grayscale mugshot images that came from somewhere. Maybe part of them from National Institute of Standards and part of them from somewhere else. And then we've got 40,000 RGB facial images that were collected from these different academic sites. And read the two descriptions and realize that there's a couple of things wrong here or problematic here. All of the images that are going to be put in the category criminal start off life as grayscale. All of the images that are going to be put in the category non-criminal start off life as RGB, red, green, blue, 24-bit per pixel. All the images that are mugshots start off life in PNG format. All the images that are going to be non-criminal start off life as JPEG, probably with some level of compression in them. And in the United States, if you're arrested, it doesn't mean you committed a crime. It means there was a suspicion that you committed a crime, or they at least needed to move you out of wherever you were because you were going to embarrass some politician who was coming through. But you might be totally released and with no charges, right? So we got that problem. And then we got these people in all these academic data sets that some of whom are going to be celebrities. And well, occasionally a celebrity commits some kind of crime. So we're not sure about the level of purity of the two data sets. So the simpler of the two problems is maybe that, you know, your category label meaning. Arrested does not mean with 100% certainty criminal, or even, no one really knows what the percent certainty is there. And unknown arrest record is far from meaning with certainty that you're not a criminal, right? So that's a little bit of a problem. But then the thing that should be more troubling for every computer science major, especially anyone who's done data science or thought about machine learning, is that I'm going to put these images in two categories. And every image I put in category A came from one source. And every image I put in category B came from another source. So if you just told me what source an image came from, I could tell you what category to put it in. Now, okay, so you've got this deeper problem. The category source correlation is 100%. That should drive you nuts if you're a data science person. And they didn't show pictures of their images from different sources in the original paper. This is from our paper where we went and got the data sets they claimed they used and pulled out the pictures. The upper left, part A of the figure, is an example of a grayscale mugshot image from the NIST special database that was referenced. The other 5 are examples of the 5 named RGB open source face image data sets that were mentioned for the non-criminal category. And D in particular is more of a graphic rendering of faces rather than a photograph, right? In other words, you can take the photograph and you've got background and everything in it. You can do a graphic rendering of the representation of the face and sort of get it floating out there disembodied. So what they called criminal and non-criminal was really arrested and unknown arrest record. And every arrested image started off life PNG. It was grayscale originally. It was an image of a printed picture. And they were all digitized with the same sensor in a very controlled setting. Every image in the non-criminal category started off life as JPEG, compressible, was converted to color, from color to grayscale by the same algorithm used by the authors. So now the grayscale, even though you have grayscale versions of all the images, they were done 2 different ways. And they were, except for the one graphic rendering, they were all photos of a person taken by different cameras under varied imaging conditions without standard background or anything like that. You could have just been detecting whether the image started off life in PNG or JPEG format. You could have just been detecting whether or not it was digitized grayscale and maybe the brightness was made uniform, or it was digitized grayscale again at a different point in time. And there's a whole bunch of other things you could be detecting other than anything that has to do with criminal, non-criminal. This is their graph of accuracy. And so they're training for some number of epochs, and they're measuring the accuracy, and they talk about training accuracy and test accuracy. They take some percentage of their criminal category and use it for training, and hold out some and use it for testing, and take their non-criminal category and use the same percentage of it. I think it's 5,000 images. I think it was an 80-20 split, but I don't remember. Some amount for training and some amount for testing. The problem would be that the test data has the same category source correlation as the training data. So there's nothing here to save you from learning that all of the non-criminal photos have a white shirt and a dark jacket on, and all of the criminal photos don't, right? There's nothing that you've done to make the pictures the same except for the face. So they use training to derive the weights of the network. Validation to choose between the models. So I would actually talk about their test as their validation data, because they're not taking the model at the end of training, they're picking the highest performing model during training on their test data. So I would actually want to say validation. And their test data should really be a separate set of data that hasn't been seen yet. And ideally, if you're doing something this important, should have come from different sources than the ones you're training and validating on. So you're ensuring yourself against an accident of learning something on the training data. They don't have anything like that. So we decided we could probably reproduce their experiment in a smaller form. We don't have any idea how they got 5,000 mugshot images, but we could get 1,721 frontal mugshot images from the NIST data set, which doesn't have 8,401 in it. We could pick one of their data sets for non-criminal and labeled faces in the wild, fairly well-known data set. I think one of the others of theirs is no longer available. And we could train a classifier on those. And so our NIST special database 18 would be the images in the top. They don't really have black rectangles around the eyes. That was added for publication because these people had been arrested. If they were still alive, they wouldn't be embarrassed by their face images being used. And the labeled faces in the wild is just celebrities of some type. So we converted the labeled faces in the wild to grayscale. And so we have grayscale category B and grayscale category A. We used a feature vector called histogram of oriented gradient. So this is something kind of pre-deep neural networks. So we decided to flush deep neural networks from our version. And we used a support vector machine classifier trained on 60% of the data. And we were able, on this smaller amount of data, using no deep neural networks at all, get 95.9 or 96% accuracy categorizing the two categories, whatever you want to call them. I think we basically reproduced their result, right? So we decided, though, we've got the classifier. It's 96% accurate. What if we use it on some other data set? We don't have a lot of data sets where we actually know for certain criminal, non-criminal that were accessible immediately. But we can get something called the ferret data set. You remember the ferret evaluation methodology from back in the face recognition section at the beginning, right? We can get that. And those are, because of the Jonathan Phillips was at, I think, Army Night Vision Lab, and one of the professors working with him was at George Mason University, not the same professor. The images for the early ferret came from Night Vision Lab and George Mason University. And so we could get those images. We could get the same number as used in the other test set. And so we would be taking the A and B categories to train a machine learning algorithm to categorize images, and we would then run it on C. And because the people in C are university professors or night vision lab government employees who probably have security clearance to work at night vision lab, we're going to expect that for our separate source test set, we probably shouldn't see a high rate of criminal categorization, right? We're hoping people with government clearances don't have a lot of criminal backgrounds, and we're hoping that George Mason University doesn't have a lot of criminal backgrounds, right? So what kind of accuracy of predicting on this subset of data from ferret, government employees and university community, what kind of accuracy would let you think, maybe you have an algorithm that works? What fraction of predicting criminal on this data set that I'm asserting should be predominantly non-criminal would you accept? Would you have to be like 90% non-criminal? 80%? 70%? 60%? What would you think? Nobody's guessing. When we ran it, we actually got 37% of the test set predicted non-criminal and 63% predicted criminal. It was the only test that we tried. This is not a cherry-picked result, right? It's just, we pick another data set, you think it's gotta be predominantly non-criminal, and the algorithm that you trained that was 96% accurate comes back and says, hey, 63% of this group of people are criminal. If this was being run by somebody who believed that it worked, this would be disastrous for a large number of people, right? Security clearances pulled, investigations done, all sorts of stuff, all wasted, right? Because what we learned wasn't really the concepts that we had named them. We learned something accidental about the face images. What did we learn accidental? It's not really clear. It's not as obvious to me when you look at the black and white of the suit and the shirt, right? What was going on between the categories of images? But it's something that you can pick up with histogram-oriented gradient features and with support vector machine classifier. Okay, so you didn't do this. You really didn't. There is no evidence that the trained model can actually predict criminal, non-criminal. Maybe it predicts PNG JPEG or converted to grayscale from this algorithm versus converted to grayscale from that algorithm, something like that. Belief that you can do criminality from face will cause you to waste resources. And eventually it will cause somebody in some police department or some government to actually take one of these algorithms that they probably paid somebody a ridiculous amount of money for, run it on some segment of their population, and falsely accuse, but also falsely certify as non-criminal some people who are, right? Which could be an enormous cost to society. Okay, so I sent, this is kind of delicate work because you're, I was going to say attacking, which is, I guess, okay. You're sort of attacking the work of an academic colleague of some sort. And so I sent the paper that Dr. King and Dr. Scheirer and Kushal and I were working on as we got near the end of it. I sent it to the editors of the other journal and to the authors of the other paper so that they would, just, full disclosure, this is going to show up in a couple of months. If you have any reaction to it, you want to talk about it, let us know, kind of thing. And not too long after, I went to the Journal of Big Data to grab the paper again for some reason, and there was a retraction notice. So Journal of Big Data had decided to retract the original paper. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's great. They didn't tell me they were going to do that, but that's a perfectly reasonable reaction to what we've done. But read the bottom part. The authors have retracted this article. because they did not seek approval from their ethics committee before undertaking this study that uses human biometric data. Both authors agree with this transaction. Nothing about the data sets can't be identified that were actually used. Nothing about this problem can't be solved. Nothing about accidentally learning features of categories because you got data from two different sources, but about we didn't seek approval from the ethics review board. Now, I've done IRB approved studies at Notre Dame for going on 25 years. Bunch of different internal, and I kind of have a feel for what you have to do and what you don't. If you're getting images from the National Institute of Standards that are distributed with no permission form, you don't need an IRB approval. If you're downloading them from another university in the US and they've been legally collected, you don't need IRB approval. So it's true, absolutely true, that they didn't get IRB approval. But I would say that that's almost certainly because no IRB approval should be needed. And so the retraction is more to have the paper retracted between the journal and the authors, in my mind, than it is identifying the real reason. It would be more awkward for the journal and the authors to say why they actually pulled it back than to fall on their pseudo sword and say that they forgot to get IRB approval that wasn't needed. Then there's this other paper that I mentioned briefly earlier that came along was published after the one we just talked about, except in 2023. So the other one has been out there a while and it's retracted. And this paper says something very similar to what the other paper said. The proposed methodology was examined using a public database known as the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Well, the database isn't the National Institute of Standards, but I guess they're saying it comes from the National Institute of Standards. And the NIST database houses 8,401 images in total. Where have you seen that number before? That was the number claimed to be gotten from the database in the other paper, which it doesn't actually the number of images in there. So in my mind, there's no way that these people didn't know about the other paper. They even copied the number 8,401 from the other paper, with even less indication of where the data set is. Their reference for the data set is some paper by Lior Wolf that has nothing to do with NIST or NIST data sets, right? So they don't cite where you could get the data set. They have a number that was made up by authors in another paper, and they think they got both criminal and non-criminal images from that data set. So I have no idea what they were actually doing. Yet the paper did show up in a Springer journal, Multimedia Tools and Applications. And I'm about to do a couple minutes on data science lessons. But one lesson would be peer-reviewed research. You hear that phrase a lot, maybe even more in the current time in connections with life science and things like that. Those are peer-reviewed journals. Those are peer-reviewed journals published by Springer. The failure rate of the peer review system is non-zero. I don't know how high it is, but it's disturbingly high in the few things where I've been motivated to go check things. Like the reviewers should have known that these papers were fabricating results because the basic numbers just didn't work out. And the editor should have cared more than they cared, in my opinion. Data science principles. You have to understand the theory of the problem. If they had confronted, well, okay, what am I going to label these 3 images of Elizabeth Holmes? There's a good chance they would have gone, this problem doesn't make sense. Certainly for the general population, right? They'd never dealt with that. It was much too much of, it's a cool idea. There's a data set I could use. There's a data set I could use. Let's get this paper out as quickly as possible. We might become famous. Ooh, yes, you might, but maybe not the way you wanted. Every time you pick up a paper that says it's going to categorize things, and they didn't do the step of saying, okay, I'm going to acquire my images from the same setting for both categories, the team photos and I crop out somebody who's a convicted criminal and somebody who's retired and everybody gives great things about and put those in, right? You left the systematic difference there for the machine learning to pick up, and the machine learning doesn't know how to not pick it up, right? So this concept source correlation nearly guarantees that what you're going to learn is going to be based on something incidental to your data set. And it's going to fail spectacularly when you go to field it. If you think you've really got something, yeah, you need to acquire your data set that you're going to develop the algorithm on, and you might call part of that data test data. But the real test data is data that comes from different sources than your training and normal test data. It's the separate source not yet used in my experiments that really gives you a feeling of, did you make a methodological mistake somewhere in development? As long as you're using just subsets of the same data for training and validation and test, you don't have any check on you have made a methodological oversight. It could be there, could not be there. You don't think it is, but why would you go public with something like this without making that check? Low cost, high embarrassment avoidance, right? It's a simple thing to do. The data set should be clear what they are, and almost all the time they should be available to others so that others can replicate the work. Occasionally, when I was editor-in-chief, we did accept papers where we knew the data set couldn't be available, and there was a reason why it couldn't be available. It was like acquired on underage people and their ethical concerns with making it generally available, but the work is vetted as good as you can, and the result is important. But you would say, okay, we know we shouldn't do this, but we're doing it anyway because we think the result is important. It shouldn't be the case that you immediately go to where the data set is supposed to come from and the numbers don't match. And different publications have different levels of reputation for rigorousness. And so for better or worse, simply as a fact that I'm giving this talk, the Journal of Big Data and the Multimedia Tools and Applications Journal of Springer, their reputation is slowly declining, right? For what kind of peer review are you doing? What kind of checking are you doing?